The old man's chair creaked the way old chairs do, the way old men do, settling into shade thrown long by a clubhouse wall that had seen 40 summers of engine grease and cigarette smoke bleed into its paint. Beside him, under a pane of glass gone faintly gold with age, sat a motorcycle that did not look like much. Faded tank. Chrome gone soft and gray at the edges, a little rust still visible along the frame where restoration had chosen honesty over perfection. His granddaughter sat cross-legged in the dirt, 12 years old, chin propped on her fists, looking at the bike the way kids look at things adults have told them are important, without telling them why. That thing, he said, made grown men cry. She didn't laugh. She'd learned not to, around him, when his voice went low like that. Big men, he said. Men you'd cross the street to avoid. I watched it happen. I was standing right there. The light was doing what October light does in that part of the country, stretching thin and orange across the yard, catching the dust kicked up by boots and the smoke curling off someone's cigarette by the fence line, turning gold to bronze to the deep color of something ending. He watched it slide down the clubhouse wall, inch by inch, patient as a debt coming due. "How old were you?" she asked. "Younger than your father is now." He said it like it surprised him every time. "Young enough to think I understood things." She waited. She had her mother's patience, which was to say she had none of it, but she'd learned that waiting sometimes worked on him where asking didn't. "There's a name on a wall inside," he said, nodding toward the clubhouse door, dark and cool beyond the yard's heat. "Carol Ashby. You've walked past it 100 times and never asked." "Who is she?" "A woman who buried her husband and then almost lost the last thing he ever made." He looked at the bike again, at the 3 interlocking rings, stamped faint into the engine case behind the glass. Worn, but not gone, never gone. Almost. The sun kept falling. Somewhere behind them a screen door slapped shut, and a dog they'd had for years lifted its head, decided nothing was wrong, and put it back down. "I'll tell you the whole thing," he said, "start to finish. But the light's going, and this isn't a story you rush. Is it sad?" He considered that longer than the question seemed to deserve. "It starts sad," he said. "Cold morning, a county auction, a crowd of men laughing at something they didn't understand. It starts about as low as a man can start." He shifted in the chair, joints announcing themselves, and for a moment he looked at his own hands, scarred, thick-knuckled, a mechanic's hands even now, decades removed from the last engine he'd rebuilt. "But you asked me how it ends," he said, "and I told you. It ends with her name on that wall. Everything between is just how we got there." The light dropped another inch down the wall. "So," he said, "October, Iron Ridge, cold enough to see your breath." The lot sat behind the county fairgrounds, gravel and frost-hardened mud, and the cold had teeth that morning. He remembered that first. The cold, how it came up through boot soles and settled in the joints, how the breath of 40 men hung over the crowd like something the sky had exhaled and forgotten to take back. She stood apart from all of it. Not by much. 10 feet, maybe 12, but it might as well have been a county line. She wore a coat too thin for the weather, and gloves with one finger worn through, and she stood with her arms crossed over herself in a way that wasn't cold, or wasn't only cold. He'd seen that stance before, overseas mostly, the particular way a body holds itself when it has already lost something and is bracing to lose the last of it in public. The auctioneer worked through farm equipment first, a disc harrow, a stock trailer with a bad axle, a crate of hand tools nobody wanted enough to fight over. Then 2 men in coveralls wheeled the panhead up onto the gravel, and the crowd did what crowds do to things they don't understand. They laughed. Not cruelly exactly, carelessly. Which is worse in its way, because cruelty at least admits the other person is there. "What in God's name is this?" someone said, loud enough to be a performance. Rust had eaten through the fender skirts. One tire had gone flat sometime in the last winter, and stayed that way. The tank was dented on the left side like it had gone down hard once, decades ago, and never been made whole again. The auctioneer put a boot on the kickstand, gave it a shake to prove it stood, and grinned out at the crowd like a man selling a joke. "Scrap metal," he called out. "Somebody's garage decoration. Who'll give me $50?" Nobody moved for a second. Then a hand went up, half in jest, and a few men laughed again, and somewhere in that laughter he saw her flinch. Small, quick, gone before most would have caught it. He caught it. He'd spent 40 years learning to catch things like that, in men who'd come back from places that didn't let you leave clean, and the habit didn't know how to switch off, just because the war was long over. 50 going once, the auctioneer said. He hadn't planned to be there that morning. He'd come for a transmission out of a wrecked pickup 2 lots down, cash in his jacket for exactly that and nothing more. He told his granddaughter that part like it mattered, like the ledger of small accidents was the whole engine of the story, and maybe it was. He stepped closer instead, close enough to see the engine case under the grime, close enough to see 3 rings, faint, stamped into the aluminum, catching what little light the morning had to spare. He didn't know her name yet. He only knew the shape of her. A woman standing very still in a coat too thin for October, arms crossed like she was holding her own ribs together. 14 months, he'd learn later. 14 months since the man who owned that panhead had gone down in his own driveway with a wrench still in his hand, dead of a heart that had simply stopped asking permission. 14 months of casseroles that stopped coming after the 3rd week, of a house that got quieter than a house should get, of bills arriving in envelopes that all looked the same shade of certain. $38,000. He didn't know that number yet either. He'd hear it later, said flat and without self-pity, the way people say numbers they've already cried over and don't intend to cry over again. Hospital, ambulance, the funeral home on Route 9 that didn't offer a payment plan so much as a slow drowning. She'd sold the truck first. Then the tools, most of them, boxed up and carried off by men who didn't look her in the eye either. The bike was what was left. The bike was what she had put off selling for 13 of those 14 months, because selling it meant there was nothing else in that garage that still smelled like him. He watched her watch the auctioneer's hand rise and fall over the bike like it was nothing. $50. He'd spent 40 years reading men who'd learned to keep their faces still in worse rooms than this one, and he read her the same way. The flinch, swallowed. The chin, lifted a half-inch too high to be natural. She wasn't there to remember her husband. She was there because a hospital in another county wanted its money and didn't care whose garage it came out of. He told his granddaughter, years later, that he almost let it go. That the transmission 2 lots down was real money he actually had, and the crowd was already thinning toward it, and a man could tell himself 100 honest reasons to keep walking. But he'd caught the rings in the aluminum, 3 of them, interlocked, stamped so faint most eyes would read it as scarring from age. He'd seen that mark exactly twice before in 40 years, once in a photograph in a dead man's scrapbook, once in a rumor passed between clubs, like a relic nobody quite believed in. 50 going once, the auctioneer said again, bored, already looking past it. He didn't raise his hand. Not yet. He stood there instead, close enough now to smell the old oil and cold rubber, close enough to see the woman's knuckles whiten around her own elbows, and he understood, with the specific dread of a man who has learned to trust his instincts more than his wallet, that he was about to become part of something he did not yet have the shape of. He'd arrived 22 minutes late, engine still ticking heat behind him, 2 brothers at his back who'd only come because he'd used the word ringmaker over the phone, and hung up before they could ask what he meant. The tip had come from a scrapyard contact 3 counties over, a widow's estate, a panhead nobody local wanted, going out for pennies on a cold Tuesday. That kind of call came in every few months. 99 times out of 100 it was nothing. A rusted frame, a borrowed name stamped on a tank by some kid in the 70s trying to look outlaw. He'd learned to expect nothing and go anyway, because the one time it mattered, it would look exactly like every time it didn't. He parked the 3 bikes at the edge of the gravel lot, deliberately, the way a man parks when he wants to be seen without announcing anything. Nobody in that crowd needed to know what 3 patches meant. They'd know soon enough by the way the air changed. The mockery reached him before the bike did. A man in a canvas coat, laughing loud enough to perform it, saying something about scrap weight and the price of aluminum. A woman near the flatbed laughing too. quieter, the kind of laugh that costs nothing and means less. He watched the crowd the way he'd once watched a tree line, not for what was obvious, but for what didn't move the way everything around it moved. The widow didn't laugh. That told him more than the engine did, at first. She stood off to the side with her coat buttoned wrong, one button skipped near the collar, the kind of mistake a person makes when dressing in a house that no longer has anyone in it to notice. His face gave nothing. 40 years of practice had made sure of that. Inside, though, something had already tightened. The specific, cold recognition of a man who has spent 4 decades listening for one particular sound in a world full of noise, and has just heard it, faint, underneath everything else. One of the brothers beside him muttered something about heading over to the transmission lot, and he didn't answer. He was doing the math men like him always did without meaning to. Miles put on the club's search over the years. Names chased and abandoned. Old-timers who'd died still swearing the ringmaker's last build existed somewhere, unrecognized, waiting in a garage nobody thought to look in. He thought, it's not supposed to be this easy. He thought, it never is, so this probably isn't it either. But his boots were already carrying him forward through the thinning crowd, past the man in the canvas coat, past the auctioneer's bored cadence, close enough now to see the case plate clearly, close enough to see the woman's knuckles go white around her own elbows, as if she already understood, before anyone said a word, that something in her life had just changed direction. He didn't ask permission. Men who ask permission at an auction lose the thing they're asking about, and 40 years of instinct told him this was not a moment for manners. He put one hand on the handlebar, the way you'd put a hand on a horse that might bolt, slow, flat-palmed, and crouched down beside the primary case with his knees popping like dry wood. The crowd noise thinned to nothing in his ears. Grime first. Decades of it, black and gummed into the fins, oil varnish gone hard as lacquer, dust from some barn or shed that had swallowed this machine whole and kept it from the world for reasons nobody standing here yet understood. He worked his thumb against the casing near the base, where a builder always signs his work if he signs it at all. Low, hidden, meant for a mechanic's hands and nobody else's eyes. Nothing. He shifted his weight, wiped his thumb on his jeans, tried again lower, where the case curved into the mounting boss. His thumbnail caught an edge. Not damage, not corrosion. A ridge, deliberate, geometric in a way the wear around it wasn't. He worked the pad of his thumb against it in small circles, patient, the way he'd been taught to strip corrosion off a carburetor bowl without gouging the metal beneath, and the grime came away in a fine gray curl. A ring. He kept going, breath shallow now, aware of his own pulse in his fingertips in a way he hadn't been in years. A second ring, interlocked with the first. Then a third, smaller, tucked into the space where the other two overlapped, exactly where it always was in the photographs the older brothers had shown him back when he was young enough to still ask questions about the club's ghosts. He stopped breathing. Somewhere behind him, the auctioneer was already talking, some line about a nice old cruiser, somebody's granddad's toy, and the words came through like sound underwater, meaningless, from another life. He stayed crouched there a moment too long, long enough that the woman a few feet away, Carol, though he didn't know her name yet, only knew her by the white-knuckled grip on her own arms, took half a step toward him without seeming to decide to. He looked up at her. Her face was doing the thing faces do when they already know the answer and are waiting to be told anyway. "Where'd this bike come from?" he said. Not loud, not a question with room in it for a small answer. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out at first. Behind him, he heard boots on gravel, brothers drifting closer, reading his stillness the way he'd once taught half of them to read a room, a wound, a lie. "My husband built it," she finally said. "Fixed it. I never understood the engine part." He looked back down at the case, at the 3 rings sitting under 40 years of dirt like a name someone had waited decades to be called by, and felt the ground under the whole morning tilt. "My grandmother used to say, a man carries his real age in his hands, not his face." He believed that. His hands had been 22 years old in a motor pool outside Da Nang, guessing at torque specs by feel, because the manual had been printed for a different engine entirely. They had been 31 years old the first time a brother slid a photograph across a bar table, a blurred engine case, 3 rings stamped into aluminum, a rumor wearing the shape of a legend. They had been every age since then, turning wrenches on other men's machines, while one name sat in the back of his mind, like a debt nobody would let him pay off. The Ringmaker. 40 years of that name passed hand to hand through the club like a coin too valuable to spend. Some claimed he'd died broke in Reno, some claimed Mexico, some claimed he was never a real man at all, just a story bikers told each other to feel like the road still had mysteries left in it. But the ones who'd ridden longest, the ones with gray in their beards and old grief in their eyes, they knew different. They knew a distributor family had cheated him out of a patent and every dollar owed on it, and that he'd vanished, rather than watch his work get sold under someone else's name. A debt like that doesn't age out. It just waits. He had chased that story the way some men chase a woman who left them, not expecting to find her, just needing to keep looking so the leaving wouldn't be the last word. He'd stood over 100 junked panheads in 100 gravel lots, always checking the case, always disappointed, always coming back the next season anyway. His brothers used to rib him about it, gently, the way you rib a man about a wound that's mostly scarred over. Not anymore. Not for years. He figured the case, if it existed at all, had been melted down decades ago for scrap value, the way most forgotten genius gets melted down eventually. Now his knees were aching on cold gravel in Iron Ridge, and 3 rings were looking up at him out of 40 years of dirt, and a woman was standing close enough that he could hear her breathing change. He should have felt triumph. He'd looked for this so long that triumph seemed like the correct shape for the moment. Instead, what moved through him was something closer to grief, sharpened at the edges. Grief for a man he'd never met. Grief for a debt that had outlived the men who owed it, and the men it was owed to. Grief for all the years spent looking that had somehow ended here, in a stranger's driveway, in front of a widow who didn't know what she was standing next to. "Ma'am," he said, and his own voice sounded unfamiliar to him, "I need you to not sell this bike today." My grandfather told this part slow, always, like the memory itself needed time to get its boots on right. He said the widow just looked at him, didn't answer, didn't nod, just looked, and that was the moment a black Cadillac Escalade turned off the county road and rolled into the gravel lot like it already owned it. He said you could tell everything about a man by how he opened a car door in front of strangers. This one didn't hurry. This one let the door swing wide and stood there a second, letting the cold morning arrange itself around him, before he stepped out in a wool coat that cost more than most of the trucks parked in that lot combined. A second man got out the passenger side, younger, glasses, a leather folio tucked under one arm like a hymnal. The collector didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the auctioneer's stand, or the folding chairs, or the woman standing beside her dead husband's motorcycle with her arms crossed against the cold. He walked straight for the panhead, the way a man walks toward something he's already decided belongs to him. My grandfather said he watched the appraiser lean close to the engine case, not touching, just looking, the way you look at a hand of cards you don't want anyone else to see. Watched him straighten up too fast. Watched him say something low, 3 or 4 words, mouth barely moving. The collector didn't smile. That was the thing my grandfather always said stuck with him. The man didn't smile, didn't blink, didn't do any of the things a man does when he's just found out he's standing next to more money than he expected. He simply turned his head, slow, toward the auctioneer. "Bid it early," he said. "Not loud, not meant for the crowd. Fast, before anyone else does the math." The appraiser nodded like a man agreeing to keep a secret he'd already decided wasn't really a secret, more a technicality. My grandfather said that was when he understood the shape of the whole day changing under him. Not the machine, not the widow, but the geometry of who was allowed to know what and when. He said he'd spent 40 years chasing a ghost through swap meets and salvage yards and dead men's garages, and here it was, about to be bought out from under a grieving woman for the price of a used pickup truck, by a man in a coat that cost more than her husband's funeral. He said Deacon, that's what they called the mechanic turned biker back then, though the name doesn't matter much now. Deacon didn't move, didn't shout, just watched the collector's mouth. The small, satisfied stillness of it, the practiced patience of a man who had done this before, to other widows, in other gravel lots, in other forgotten towns nobody remembered the names of. "Grandpa," I said, "did he know you were watching him?" He shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "That was the mistake." My grandfather said that was the part he replayed most, in the years after, when he couldn't sleep. Not the appraiser's nod, not the coat, the way Deacon crossed that gravel lot like he had all the time in the world, when everyone else in Iron Ridge that morning was moving like the cold had a deadline. He said Deacon didn't go to the bike first. He went to her. She was standing off from the crowd, arms folded tight across a coat too thin for October, watching the auctioneer's assistant chalk a number onto her husband's gas tank like it was a used refrigerator. My grandfather said you could see her deciding, right there, not to cry. Some people wear grief loud. She wore hers like a debt she intended to pay off quietly and never mention again. Deacon stopped a few feet short of her, didn't crowd her. My grandfather said that was the thing about him. 40 years of finding things other men had given up looking for, and he still knew how to stand still around a person who'd flinch at being approached too fast. "Ma'am," he said, "that your husband's machine?" She didn't look at him right away. "Was," she said. "Mind if I ask his name?" She did mind. My grandfather said you could see it settle over her face, that particular tiredness of a woman who has spent 14 months answering questions about a dead man to people who didn't know him, didn't care, and were only asking because it was the polite shape a sentence took before getting to the part they actually wanted. "Ray," she said. "Ray Ashby. He a mechanic?" 41 years. She said it flat, like a fact she'd stopped being proud of out loud, because pride didn't pay the funeral home. Fixed everything from combines to Cadillacs. That bike was the only thing he ever kept for himself. Deacon nodded slow. My grandfather said he had a way of nodding that made you feel like he was filing something away rather than just being polite. He built the engine himself? Something moved behind her eyes then, quick, guarded, gone almost before it arrived. My grandfather said it was the first crack he saw in her, small as a hairline in a windshield, the kind you don't notice until winter finds it. He didn't talk about that, she said. Not to me, not to anybody. Somebody teach him? I said he didn't talk about it. Her voice had an edge now, thin as wire. You buying? Or you just curious? Deacon didn't answer right away. My grandfather said that pause was the whole man in miniature, a lifetime of learning that silence cost you nothing and told you everything, if you let it sit long enough on the other person's shoulders instead of your own. Little of both, he finally said. She looked at him then. Really looked, my grandfather said. The way you look at something you can't decide is a threat or the first honest question anyone's asked you in over a year. My grandfather said Carol's shoulders came down half an inch after that. Not surrender, he said. More like a woman deciding a fight wasn't worth the breath it cost. The wind had picked up by then, carrying grit off the gravel lot, and she pulled her coat tighter without seeming to notice she'd done it. He trained under someone, she said, once, a long time ago. Deacon didn't move. My grandfather said he had a talent for stillness that made other men fill the silence just to escape it. But Carol wasn't other men. She let the quiet sit there, like a third person standing between them. Before it all went wrong, she added, finally, like the words cost her something she'd been saving for years. Wrong how? I don't know. She said it flat, and my grandfather believed her, mostly. He'd get a look sometimes. Working late in the garage, radio off, just him and a wrench, and that look on his face like he was somewhere else. I asked him once who taught him to build like that. She stopped. What did he say? He said the man was better than anybody knew, and it didn't matter now, because the world forgot him, and he wasn't going to argue with the world. Her jaw tightened. That's it. That's all 31 years of marriage got me on the subject. My grandfather said. Deacon's eyes went to the engine case again, quick, like a man checking a compass. 3 rings, stamped deep, worn smooth at the edges from 4 decades of hands. He ever say a name? No. Carol's voice cracked at the edge of the word, just barely, and she covered it by looking off toward the auction tent, where the crowd noise rose and fell like surf. He wasn't a man who gave things away easy. Names, feelings, money. A pause. Especially not feelings. Sounds like somebody I used to know, Deacon said, and my grandfather told me it wasn't meant as comfort, just fact, but it landed like comfort anyway. Carol almost smiled. Almost. He loved that bike more than he loved talking about it, she said. Every October he'd bring it out, run it for an hour just to hear it, then put it back under the tarp. Never rode it further than the mailbox. She looked down at the frame like it might answer for him. I used to think that was strange. Now I think maybe he was scared of what riding it too far might stir up. Deacon crouched again, ran a thumb along the down tube, slow, deliberate, the way my grandfather said a man reads Braille he isn't sure is really there. He didn't say what he was thinking. He rarely did, back then. But my grandfather remembered the exact second Deacon's hand stopped moving, right where the tube met the frame junction, a seam just a hair too clean, too deliberate, hiding under 40 years of dust like it had been waiting the whole time for somebody patient enough to find it. My grandfather said Deacon straightened up too fast, like the seam had bitten him, and that was when the auctioneer's voice cracked over the loudspeaker and called the lot number, and there wasn't time left to chase whatever he'd found. The crowd shifted. Boots on gravel, coffee cups crushed into a trash barrel, somebody's kid whining about the cold. Carol stepped back from the bike like she was giving it room to be judged without her in the way. The collector didn't move from where he stood, hands in his coat pockets, sunglasses pushed up on his head, even though the sky was the color of dishwater. He let the auctioneer finish the description. 1948 Panhead, running condition unknown, sold as is, before he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has already decided how a thing will end. 200, he said. Somebody laughed. Not cruel, exactly. The tired laugh of men who'd stood in cold fields all morning, watching farm equipment go for less than its steel was worth, glad for something to break the monotony. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a voice built for cattle sales, tried for a rhythm anyway. 2. Do I hear 250, 250, 250? Nobody bid against it. My grandfather said that was the part that stayed with him longest. Not the number itself, but the silence after it. How a crowd of 40 people could look at 4 decades of a man's life, laid out on a flatbed trailer, and see nothing worth raising a hand for. 200 once. Carol's shoulders went down, not dramatically, an inch, maybe less. My grandfather was watching her instead of the bike by then, and he said it was like watching a woman absorb a blow she'd already braced for, which somehow made it worse, not better. 200 twice. Deacon hadn't moved from the frame. He was still crouched at the wheel, one hand resting flat on the fender, not bidding, not speaking, and my grandfather remembered thinking he'd missed his window, that whatever he'd felt under his thumb a minute ago was about to get carried off a flatbed for less than the price of a used lawnmower. Going once. The word hung there. Frost on the grass hadn't burned off yet in the shade of the trailer, and somewhere behind them, a dog barked twice and quit. Going twi. Deacon lifted his hand. He didn't call a number. He just raised it, slow, the way a man signals a question in a room he doesn't trust, and the auctioneer stopped mid-word, chalk-white breath curling up in front of his face, waiting. Carol looked at him, not hopeful, just tired enough to want to know what came next. 250, Deacon said. Not loud. He never was loud, my grandfather told me, not once in the 30 years he rode behind him, but the number cut through that cold field like a rifle crack, and every head in that huddle of coats and coffee cups turned at once, the way birds turn on a wire when one of them spooks. The auctioneer blinked, recalculated something behind his eyes. 250, I have 250, from the gentleman at the wheel. The collector's head came up. My grandfather said that was the moment he understood something had shifted, though he couldn't have said what yet. The collector had been watching the bike the whole time with the flat, unhurried patience of a man who already knew he'd win, checking his phone between bids, barely glancing at the crowd. Now his eyes found Deacon and stayed there, not startled, recalculating. My grandfather said it was like watching a man reread a contract he thought he'd already understood, looking for the clause he'd missed. 300, the collector said. Quick, too quick. Deacon didn't answer right away. He straightened up off his crouch by the fender, slow, joints cracking audibly in the cold, and for a second he just looked at the bike instead of the room, the way a man looks at something he's already decided he's not walking away from. Carol's eyes moved between the two men, like she was watching a hand of cards get played that she didn't fully understand the rules of. 350, Deacon said. Somebody in the crowd let out a low whistle. Somebody else laughed, but it was a different laugh than before. Thinner, uncertain, the kind of laugh people make when they realize the joke might not be theirs anymore. My grandfather said he felt it too, standing there in his cut, with his hands jammed in his pockets against the cold, that particular electricity that runs through a crowd when they sense they've misjudged something, though none of them yet knew what. The collector's jaw worked. He looked at the engine case again, differently this time, not with contempt but with the narrowed, calculating attention of a man reassessing an opponent he'd dismissed too early. Then he looked at Deacon's cut, the patches, the gray in his beard, like he was trying to place him in some ledger of people who mattered and people who didn't. 400, the collector said, and this time there was an edge in it that hadn't been there before. Carol's hand had gone to her mouth, not from hope, my grandfather said, from confusion. $400 was more than she'd let herself imagine that whole cold morning, and she had no way of knowing yet that it was still an insult, that the two men standing on either side of her husband's bike were no longer talking about scrap metal at all. Deacon looked at the collector for a long moment. Then he looked at Carol. 450, he said, and this time he didn't look away from her when he said it. The collector's mouth flattened. 500. 550. The auctioneer had gone quiet himself, my grandfather said, which never happened. The man built his whole living on never running out of words, and there he stood with his gavel loose in his hand, like he'd forgotten what it was for. The crowd had stopped being a crowd. It had become an audience, and the thing they were watching wasn't a bike anymore. It was two men deciding something between them that had nothing to do with the 20 other people standing in that cold field. 600, the collector said, and his voice had lost the smoothness now, the practiced boredom he'd walked in with. He said it fast, like a man trying to close a door before something got through it. Deacon didn't answer right away. He looked down at the engine case again, at the 3 rings stamped into the aluminum, and my grandfather said his face didn't change, not once, through any of it. That was the thing about him. Whatever he was carrying, he carried it flat. 650, Deacon said. Someone in the crowd made a sound, not quite a laugh, more like the air going out of them. Carol's face had gone from confusion to something closer to fear. She kept looking between the two men, like she was trying to read a language she'd never been taught. Her hand found the sleeve of the woman standing next to her, an old neighbor, and she gripped it without seeming to know she'd done it. "Why is he doing this?" she said. Not loud, but the field was so quiet by then that my grandfather heard it from 20 feet away. Nobody answered her. The collector's eyes had narrowed to something ugly and precise. He glanced once at his phone, thumb moving fast over the screen, and my grandfather said later that was the moment he understood the man wasn't bidding out of pride anymore. He was checking a number, confirming a ceiling, making sure whatever he said next wasn't a number he'd regret. 700, the collector said, and that's the last of it. The auctioneer's eyes went to Deacon. Deacon didn't blink. He reached into his cut, slow, unhurried, the way a man moves when he wants everyone watching to see exactly what his hands are doing, and he pulled out a folded envelope thick enough that even from a distance you could see it wasn't just paper. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. 750, he said. Cash. Right here, right now. The wind picked up across the lot, kicking dust along the gravel, and somewhere behind them, a chain rattled against a flagpole. Carol's neighbor whispered something to her that my grandfather didn't catch. The collector's jaw worked once, twice, like he was chewing on a decision he didn't want to swallow. He didn't swallow it. He raised a hand instead, palm out, like a man stopping traffic, and told the auctioneer to hold. My grandfather said that was the strangest part, not the money, the quiet. The collector walked away from the crowd, boots crunching gravel, and motioned for the auctioneer to follow him behind the flatbed trailer where the tarps were stacked. Two men in a huddle, backs to the wind. My grandfather drifted closer, casual, hands in his pockets, the way you learn to move when you want to hear something you're not invited to hear. "I'll make this simple," the collector said. 40,000. Off the books. She signs a private bill of sale, we skip the rest of this circus, everybody goes home happy. The auctioneer glanced back toward Carol, who was still standing where she'd been standing, coat pulled tight, watching the two men like she already knew this wasn't about her. "That's not how this works," the auctioneer said. "There's a bid on the floor." "There's a bid on the floor because a biker's got more cash than sense," the collector said. "Do her a favor. 40,000 is more money than that scrap heap we'll ever see again, and you know it." My grandfather said the number hit the air and just sat there, ugly and small, next to what everyone had already heard shouted across the lot. 750, cash, from a man who hadn't blinked, and now this, 40,000, whispered behind a trailer, dressed up like generosity. The auctioneer didn't answer right away. He looked over his shoulder once, toward Carol, then back at the collector, and something in his face changed. Not suspicion exactly, not yet, but the first crack of it, the look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like. "I can't take a private offer mid-auction," the auctioneer said. "You know that." "I know you can walk over there and end it," the collector said. "I know a lot of paperwork disappears if the seller just wants it over. Widows do, usually. They want it over." My grandfather said he stepped back then, quiet, before either man noticed him standing close enough to hear. He didn't go to Deacon. He went to Carol. She was still watching the trailer, arms crossed against the cold, and when he got near she asked him, low, without looking away, what they were talking about back there. "Best I can tell," my grandfather told her, "he's trying to buy you before the bidding finishes." Carol's mouth tightened. Not fear, something older than fear. "He offered before," she said, "before the auction even opened. I told him no then, too." My grandfather said that was the first time he understood the collector hadn't come to Iron Ridge on a whim. He'd been circling long before that morning, long before the tarps came off, long before anyone shouted a number into the cold October air. My grandfather said that was the moment the mechanic turned biker crossed the gravel. He didn't hurry. That was the thing my grandfather always came back to, telling it, how a man could move slow and still arrive like he meant it. Boots crunching frost-hard dirt. Hands loose at his sides. Not fists, just loose, the way a man holds his hands when he wants you to see he isn't holding anything. He stopped a few feet from Carol, didn't look at the collector once. "Don't sign anything," he said. "Not yet." Carol's arms were still crossed. She studied him the way she'd studied the trailer all morning, like something that might cost her more than it promised. "You're the one who wouldn't stop looking at the case," she said. "I need an hour," he said, "before this goes anywhere, before it goes to him, before it goes back on the block. 1 hour with the frame." "For what?" "To be sure of something." My grandfather said the collector had drifted closer by then, close enough to hear, his mouth already shaping some smooth objection, some line about wasting the lady's morning, and the mechanic-turned-biker still didn't look at him. Just kept his eyes on Carol, steady, the way you'd look at someone you were asking to trust you with something that mattered. "Sure of what?" Carol said again. "I'd rather show you than say it wrong." My grandfather said there was a long quiet after that. "The kind that isn't empty," he said, "the kind that's doing work." Carol looked past the mechanic-turned-biker to the trailer, to the bike sitting under gray sky with its stripped tank and its silence, and something in her face shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the loosening that comes before trust, the crack before the light gets in. "He offered me 40,000 for it 2 weeks ago," she said, quiet enough that only the two of them, and my grandfather standing a little apart, could hear it, before anyone else knew it existed, before the auction house even listed it. The mechanic-turned-biker's jaw tightened, just slightly, my grandfather said. Just enough to notice if you were watching for it, and he was. 40,000, he repeated. For scrap, Carol said, and there was something bitter in it now, something that had been sitting under the fear the whole time. He told me it was scrap. Give me an hour, the mechanic-turned-biker said again. You don't owe him an answer today. You don't owe anybody an answer today. Carol looked at him a long moment, then past him, at Deacon standing near the trailer, at the loose half-circle of leather and gray beards that had formed without anyone calling it a formation. My grandfather said he watched her count them, almost, watched her weigh $40,000 against whatever those men were worth, standing quiet in the cold like they had nowhere better to be. 1 hour, she said finally. The auctioneer, still holding his gavel, exhaled like a man given a reprieve he hadn't asked for. My grandfather said that was when the mechanic-turned-biker went back to the bike. Not to Carol, not to the collector, who had already turned to murmur something into a phone pressed against his shoulder. He went to the panhead, still roped to the flatbed, still wearing the dust of whatever barn it had slept in for 14 months, and he put both hands on the frame like a man checking a horse's leg for a stone bruise. He worked the down tube first. My grandfather said he didn't know what that meant at the time. Down tube, backbone, neck. Those words came later, after years of listening to men talk about frames the way other men talk about women or horses. All he saw that afternoon was a big man in a cut go quiet and still, in a way that made the cold feel suddenly larger around him. The mechanic-turned-biker knocked on the tube with one knuckle, once near the headstock, once near the weld, where the down tube met the frame's neck, a hand's width from where the paint had worn to bare metal. The second sound was different. Duller, denser. Not the hollow ring of empty tubing, but something with more weight behind it, the sound a pipe makes when it isn't just a pipe anymore. He did it again, to be sure. My grandfather said the man's face didn't change, but his breathing did, slowed down, the way a man's breathing slows when he's trying not to spook something. Somebody reinforce this? He asked, not really asking Carol, asking the bike. Carol shook her head. Not that I ever knew. He ran his thumb along the weld itself, and my grandfather, close enough now to see it, said the weld didn't look like the others on the frame, a shade rougher, a hair proud of the metal around it, done by a hand less concerned with beauty than with finishing something and finishing it well before someone came looking. Frame's heavier here than it's got any business being, the mechanic-turned-biker said. Right here, right at the weld. He looked up, found Deacon in the loose half-circle of leather. Deacon didn't say anything. He just walked over, slow, the way men walk when they don't want to spook a deer or a widow or a piece of evidence, and looked where the other man was pointing. You thinking what I'm thinking? Deacon said. It wasn't a question either. I'm thinking somebody built this frame to carry more than a motor. The collector had stopped murmuring into his phone. My grandfather said the cold seemed to change temperature right then, though nothing about the sky or the wind had moved, the fairground still gray, the flags still snapping against their poles, the auctioneer still standing with his gavel, like a man who'd forgotten what it was for. Carol, the mechanic-turned-biker said, without looking away from the weld, you mind if I take a saw to 14 months of your husband's life? Carol didn't answer right away. My grandfather said she looked at that bike the way you look at a coffin before they close it, like there's still time to change your mind about something you already decided. Then she nodded. Once. Cut it, she said. He'd have wanted somebody to look. That was all the mechanic-turned-biker needed. He called for a hacksaw, and when nobody had one close enough, somebody's saddlebag produced one anyway, because that's how it worked. You rode with what you might need for a stranger before you rode with what you needed for yourself. The circle of leather tightened around Carol and the bike, without anybody saying to do it. My grandfather said it happened the way a herd closes around a calf, unthinking, older than thought. The collector took 2 steps forward and found he couldn't take a third. Nobody touched him. Nobody had to. The saw a bit slow. The mechanic-turned-biker worked it like he was diffusing something instead of cutting it. Short strokes, checking the angle every few passes, blowing metal dust off the frame like it might sting somebody's eyes if he wasn't careful. The fairground had gone silent except for that sound. Steel teeth on steel tube, patient and small against the wind coming down off the ridge. My grandfather said he stopped breathing somewhere in there and didn't notice until his chest ached. It took 11 minutes. He counted, he said, because counting was easier than watching. When the cut section came free, there was a tube inside it, brass, dulled almost black with 40 years of sealed dark, no wider than a man's thumb, capped on both ends, and soldered shut like somebody had meant it to survive a fire. The mechanic-turned-biker held it up to the gray light and turned it once. Careful, the way you'd turn something that might still be alive. Nobody spoke. Deacon crouched next to Carol, who had both hands pressed flat over her mouth, like she was holding something in that wanted very badly to come out. "Ma'am," he said, "your husband put something in this frame a long time before he had a reason you'd know." "I don't understand," she said. Her voice came out smaller than my grandfather had heard it all morning. "Neither do we yet," Deacon said. "But we're fixing to." The collector had his phone out again, filming now instead of calling anyone, and my grandfather remembers thinking that whatever the man thought he was documenting, he had no idea he was documenting the end of himself. The mechanic-turned-biker set the tube on a folded shop rag on the truck bed, gentle, like a man laying down something with a pulse. Nobody moved to open it. "Not here," he said. "Not in this wind. Not in front of him." He didn't look at the collector when he said, "Him." But everyone understood who he meant. "She opens it first. Someplace quiet." My grandfather says, that's when the yard went quiet in a different way. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of men deciding how much to say. They loaded Carol into the cab of Deacon's truck, and 6 of them rode close around it, slow, down the county road to the diner outside town, the one with the busted sign that only lit up half its letters at night. My grandfather rode drag. He watched the collector's Suburban peel off the shoulder and follow at a distance that was supposed to look like nothing. Inside, Deacon sat across from her in a booth with cracked red vinyl, and he didn't touch the tube. He set it between them like evidence at a trial nobody had asked her to attend. "There was a man," he said, "before your husband, before any of us, really. We called him the Ringmaker." Carol shook her head, slow, like the name didn't fit anywhere in her. "He cast his own engine cases," Deacon said, "by hand. Nobody taught him. 3 rings, stamped into every one, interlocked. You don't see that mark twice in a lifetime unless somebody wanted you to." My grandfather remembers the sugar dispenser on the table, how Deacon turned it without drinking anything, just to have something in his hands. 1974, he had a falling out with a parts distributor, Deacon went on. Company said his designs were theirs. Filed the patents under their own name before he could. Man lost everything he built in about 6 weeks. Then he was gone. No funeral, no grave anybody's found. 40 years, ma'am. Our club's been asking after him that whole time. "Why?" Carol said. Not a full question. She didn't have the breath for the rest of it. "Because somebody owed him," Deacon said, "and somebody never paid." He nodded at the tube. "We think your husband knew him. Learned from him, maybe. Last one he ever taught, if the timing's right." Carol's hands were still pressed near her mouth, and my grandfather says she made a sound then that wasn't a word, more like something finally given permission to leave her chest. She'd been married to the man 31 years. 31 years of Sunday oil changes and swearing at carburetors in the garage light, and she had never once heard the name Ringmaker cross his lips. "He never told me," she said. "Man kept a lot of things quiet that were worth telling," Deacon said, gentler now. "Doesn't mean they weren't true, means he was scared of what telling would cost him." Outside the window, my grandfather could see the Suburban idling across the lot, engine running, though the man inside wasn't going anywhere yet. "We're not asking you for the bike," Deacon told her. "We're asking you to let us find out what he wanted somebody to know before we let that man out there decide what it's worth." Carol looked down at the tube like it might answer her instead of him. She didn't answer him right away. My grandfather says the room got so quiet he could hear the auction lot outside, the wind pushing an empty cup across the gravel, tap, tap, tapping against a fence post. Then Carol set the tube on the kitchen table, and her hands were shaking bad enough that Deacon reached over and steadied it without asking permission, and she let him. The cap came loose easier than it should have after 49 years, threads worn smooth by someone who'd handled it more than once before he ever welded it shut for good. Inside, rolled tight, a strip of thin brass no wider than a ruler, and on it, scratched deep with something sharper than a nail, letters a young man had pressed into metal, because paper doesn't survive what metal survives. Deacon read it out loud, because Carol's eyes wouldn't hold steady on it long enough to finish a line. 1974. He taught me casting, taught me patience, taught me a man's name means nothing if his hands don't back it. They took his drawings and called them theirs, and paid him nothing, and told him prove it. He had no lawyer, only me. I watched him lose everything he built for wanting what was owed. I will not forget what he showed me, even if the world already has. If you found this, you found the last thing he made through me. Treat it kind. No name signed at the bottom, just initials, small and careful, the same hand that had stamped 3 rings into aluminum a lifetime ago, apprentice mirroring master. Carol put both hands flat on the table, like she needed it to hold still under her. 31 years, she said again, quieter this time, like the number itself had changed shape. He watched a man get robbed of everything he made, and then he spent his whole life fixing carburetors for people who called him cheap labor and never asked him a single question. Some men carry a debt they can't pay so long they stop calling it a debt, Deacon said. Call it a habit instead, quieter that way. My grandfather remembers Carol looking toward the window then, toward the Suburban still idling, toward the man behind its wheel, who had no idea what had just been read out loud 12 feet from where he sat. She wasn't crying anymore. Something harder had moved into her face, something that hadn't been there an hour before. He's not getting that bike, she said. Deacon didn't smile, not exactly. But my grandfather says something in his shoulders eased, like a man who'd been holding a weight and had just been told he wasn't the only one lifting it anymore. My grandfather says that was the moment the crowd stopped pretending not to watch. The appraiser stood near the Suburban with a clipboard against his chest, the kind of man who wore his authority like a borrowed coat. He'd been introduced earlier, quietly, as an independent expert. Somebody the collector had flown in special. An older patch, Sawtooth, they called him, 71 years old, a man who'd ridden with the club since before most of them were born, walked up slow, the way men walk when their knees have opinions about it. He looked at the appraiser for a long moment, longer than was polite. Harmon, Sawtooth said. Not a question. The appraiser's jaw did something small. I don't believe we've met. No, Sawtooth agreed. But I met your grandfather. 1973. Man ran parts distribution out of 3 states. Told my club president the club's custom orders weren't worth the paperwork. Cheated an engine builder. Blind the year after that. Same name on the invoice as the one on your business card. The clipboard didn't move, but something behind the appraiser's eyes did. That's a family name, he said. It's not an accusation. Didn't accuse you of anything, Sawtooth said. Just said the name out loud. Funny how a name can do the work all by itself. My grandfather remembers the crowd going still in that particular way. A crowd goes still when it senses it's being let in on something it wasn't supposed to see. The auctioneer had stopped talking altogether. Even the wind seemed to have found something else to do. The collector had come around the front of the Suburban by then, his coat still buttoned against a cold that didn't touch him the way it touched everyone else standing in that gravel lot. He didn't say anything to Sawtooth. He looked at Harmon instead, and Harmon looked back at him, and in that look, my grandfather swears to this, there passed some silent negotiation between 2 men who had rehearsed being strangers. We should discuss the appraisal privately, Harmon said. We're standing in public, Deacon said. Bike's public, sales public, debt's public too, far as I'm concerned. Carol hadn't moved from the folding table. She was watching all of it with the note still in her hand, the brass tube beside it catching the gray morning light, and my grandfather says her face had settled into something he'd never seen on a grieving widow before. Not anger exactly, not yet triumph either. Recognition, maybe. The particular stillness of a woman finally understanding the shape of the thing she'd been standing inside for 31 years without knowing its name. The collector reached for his phone. Somebody's about to make a call they can't take back, my grandfather says he thought, right then, standing at the edge of the crowd with his own hands gone cold in his pockets. He was right. Harmon didn't dial anyone. He held the phone in his hand the way a man holds a rock he's already decided not to throw, and my grandfather says that was the first true thing about him all morning. That hesitation, that flicker of arithmetic behind his eyes. Everyone does that math eventually. What's the cost of finishing this versus walking away from it? Mr. Harmon. Deacon's voice hadn't risen. It didn't need to. 40 years we've been looking for that man's name on something real. You've had it on a business card the whole time. Harmon's jaw worked. He looked at the crowd. Really looked, my grandfather says, like he was counting them, weighing what each one had already heard and couldn't unhear. The auctioneer had stopped pretending to shuffle papers. Even Sawtooth had gone quiet, hands loose at his sides, watching his own boss the way a man watches weather turn. This is a family business, Harmon said finally. 3 generations. You don't get to unravel that over a rusted engine case at a county sale. Didn't unravel it, Deacon said. You did. 1974. Nobody spoke after that. My grandfather remembers the wind picking up gravel dust off the lot, remembers a dog barking somewhere past the fence line, remembers how long a silence can stretch when everyone in it is waiting for the same man to decide something. Harmon put the phone back in his coat. Withdraw the bid, he said. Quiet. Almost formal, like he was reading it off a card. I withdraw my bid. He didn't look at Carol when he said it. My grandfather thinks that was deliberate, that looking at her would have cost him something he wasn't willing to spend. Not there. Not with that many witnesses. He turned instead, buttoned his coat against wind that wasn't cold enough to need it, and walked back toward the black car parked at the fence line, Sawtooth following 2 steps behind like a shadow that had lost its shape. Nobody laughed at the bike after that. That was the part my grandfather always circles back to, telling it, how fast a crowd's mood turns, once shame finds its target. The same men who'd been grinning an hour earlier, calling it scrap, calling her a fool for hauling junk to auction, stood there with their hands in their pockets and wouldn't meet Carol's eyes. Somebody's boot scraped gravel. Somebody else cleared his throat like he meant to say something and thought better of it. Carol didn't watch the car pull away. She was still looking at the note in her hand, the brass tube beside it, like she was reading her husband's name, in a language she'd only just been given the alphabet for. He's not done, Deacon said quietly, watching the taillights shrink toward the highway. Men like that never withdraw. They regroup. He was right, my grandfather says, though not the way anyone expected. The regrouping didn't come as another black car in a gravel lot. It came as phone calls, quiet ones, made by men who'd spent 40 years learning how to find things that didn't want to be found. Deacon started it the same night, sitting at the clubhouse bar with a legal pad and a landline, working through a list of names he'd been keeping since before some of the younger Patches were born. Historians, archivists, a woman in Milwaukee who'd written the only serious book on underground engine builders of the 50s and 60s, 3 pages of which were devoted to a man she called, in a footnote, possibly mythical. He wasn't mythical. Carol had the note to prove it. Within a week, the story had legs nobody could have engineered on purpose. A widow, a dead man's secret, a vanished genius, 3 interlocking rings stamped into aluminum. Within 2 weeks, a professor of industrial history at a university in Ohio was on the phone with Deacon for 90 minutes, taking notes so fast her pen broke. Within 3, a consortium had formed, 3 regional museums pooling acquisition funds, the kind of arrangement that usually took years to assemble, done in 18 days because nobody wanted to be the institution that let this slip to a private buyer with something to hide. They sent a letter, not a phone call. My grandfather remembers that detail because Carol read it out loud at the kitchen table, her hands steady this time, steadier than they'd been in the gravel lot. The consortium wished to acquire the 1948 Panhead, chassis, engine, and provenance documentation for permanent public exhibition, framed as a recovered piece of American motorcycle history. They cited the ringmaker by name. They cited the note. They made an opening offer that made Deacon set his coffee down without drinking it. It wasn't the collector's number. It was bigger, and it came with something the collector never offered, a promise that the story would be told, not buried, that her husband's name would sit on a placard under glass, not scrubbed out of a private garage nobody but one rich man would ever see. Carol didn't answer right away. She drove out to the cemetery first, my grandfather says, though nobody saw her do it. Deacon only found out because the groundskeeper mentioned a woman had sat by a headstone for an hour with a folded letter in her lap, saying nothing to anyone, not even the stone. When she came back, she said only one thing. He'd want people to see it running. The consortium's offer was formal, generous, clean. It also wasn't the end of it, because word of that offer traveled fast enough and far enough that the collector heard it too, and men like that, Deacon had said, never withdraw. He didn't withdraw quietly. That's not how men like that lose. He tried one more move first, a lawyer's letter, dressed up polite, claiming the note itself was inadmissible, a forgery maybe, or at best a sentimental object, with no bearing on fair market value. He wanted the sale halted while the matter was reviewed. My grandfather says Deacon read that letter twice, folded it once, and drove it himself to the newspaper man who'd already run the first story. 3 days later, the second story ran, and this one had the distributor's name in it plain, the fraud from 1974, laid out next to the collector's family tree, like a blood test nobody could argue with. After that, the lawyer's letters stopped coming. It took 11 weeks, start to finish, for the paperwork to move the way paperwork moves. Slow, then all at once. November into December, the Iron Ridge cold settling in for good. Salt trucks out on the county roads, Carol's porch light burning earlier every evening. She kept working her shift at the pharmacy the whole time, because bills don't wait on museum consortiums, and because, she told Deacon once, standing still too long let the missing catch up to her. The sale finalized on a Tuesday in December. $420,000. Wired clean, no strings, the kind of number that doesn't feel real, printed on a cashier's check until you're the one holding it. It paid the $38,000 in medical debt first. That's the part people always ask about. My granddaughter asked about it too. Like the number itself is the story. It isn't. What mattered was what was left after. What mattered was that for the first time since the funeral home called about payment plans, Carol Ashby's mail didn't scare her. She could sit down at her kitchen table and open an envelope without her hands doing that thing hands do when they expect bad news. She used some of it to fix the roof, some to pay off the truck. She put money away for her sister's boy, quiet, no announcement. And she kept, framed on the wall where the wedding photo used to hang alone, a printed copy of the brass tube note. The real one stayed with the bike, sealed under glass eventually, but the copy she kept where she'd see it every morning making coffee. Grief didn't leave. Deacon was clear about that every time he told it. It doesn't work that way, he'd say, but it stopped being the only weight in the room. For over a year it had been the whole house. Now it was one thing among several: money, relief, a strange new kind of pride. And that, he said, was as close to a good ending as most people ever get. The club still had one more thing to give her. The restoration took 11 months. He remembers that part clean, no fog on it at all, because he was one of the ones with his hands in it. The tank came off first, stripped down to bare metal in the back bay, 3 coats of primer before anyone touched color. They kept the original paint code, matched it off a chip found under the seat bracket, some scrap of factory finish nobody but a mechanic would have thought to preserve. The cases got bead blasted but not polished smooth, because polishing smooth would have erased the stamp, the 3 interlocking rings, and nobody in that shop was going to let that happen twice. Deacon oversaw the engine himself, rebuilt the internals with parts sourced from 3 states, 1 crank ground down, and trued by a machinist in Ohio who did the work for free once he heard whose case it was. Nobody asked how he'd heard. Word traveled through that world the way it always had, slow and specific, one old man telling another old man a story that mattered. They didn't run it, that was the decision, made without much argument. A bike like that, you could get it running, could take it out on the highway and let it be a motorcycle again instead of a monument, but the club voted otherwise. Some things are worth more standing still. The glass case was built by a cabinet shop 2 towns over, oak frame, tempered panels, lit from underneath so the paint held a low gold shine even in the dark of the clubhouse after hours. They mounted it against the back wall, near the honorary board where names got added. Men who'd died wearing the patch, a few who'd never worn it but earned the wall some other way. They engraved her name in October, 1 year almost to the day since the auction. Small ceremony, folding chairs in the yard, coffee in paper cups. Carol didn't cry until they turned the plaque so she could read it, her name beside her husband's, and beneath both of them, smaller, the words, "The Ringmaker's Last Apprentice." She'd wanted that line added, insisted on it actually, when the first draft left it out. Deacon told his granddaughter that was the day the club stopped being just his club and started being something Carol had a key to as well. She came around after that. Not often. She wasn't built for the noise most nights. But on quiet afternoons, midweek, when the yard was empty and the bike caught the light through the west window just right. He remembers her standing in front of the case once, hand flat on the glass, not saying anything. He didn't say anything either. Some things you just let sit there, finished and unfinished at the same time. The old man stopped talking for a while. Evening had come on without him noticing. That was happening more, lately, the light going before he tracked it, and the yard had gone the color of a struck match, orange low across the gravel, the glass case throwing back the last of it like something holding its own small fire. His granddaughter hadn't moved in 20 minutes. She was looking at the panhead now, instead of at him. The chrome soft under the dust, they never quite got all the way out of the air. The 3 interlocking rings on the case catching one thin line of sun and letting it go. She reached out and touched the glass. Not the bike. She knew better than that, even young as she was. Some instinct passed down or just absorbed, sitting in that yard her whole life listening to men who talked about metal the way other families talked about scripture. She touched the glass, and her hand left a small, warm print that started fading before she'd even pulled it back. Was it worth all that? She said. The money and the fighting and everything. He thought about it longer than the question probably needed. Those men at the auction, he said, the ones laughing, they weren't wrong about the number, once it finally came out. $420,000. They'd have believed that, eventually, if you'd told them, they'd have whistled and shut up fast enough. He looked at the case. They were wrong about what it was worth. Different thing. Took me most of my life to understand there's a difference. She didn't answer that. She was young enough that it would take her a while yet, and old enough that she'd already started, which was more than most people managed. He pushed himself up from the chair slower than he used to, one hand on the arm of it, one hand finding her shoulder for the last few inches. They stood together in front of the glass a moment, an old man and a girl who hadn't been born when any of it happened, looking at a bike that had outlived the man who built it, the man who inherited it, and would very likely outlive the both of them too. Somewhere behind them, past the fence line, a screen door banged, and somebody laughed low over the sound of a radio, ordinary evening noise, the club still being exactly what it had always been. The light kept going. Neither of them moved to turn on the yard lamp yet. "Come on," he said finally. "Your grandmother's got supper waiting, and she skins me alive if I let it go cold, telling stories to you." She laughed, and let him lead her toward the house. And behind them, the glass held its shape against the dark, patient, the way it had always been, the way certain things are when they've finally been given the value they were owed.